You may continue to eat and drink, whatever you're up to, but we really want to get started to provide as much time for our speaker and for the rest of you. I mean, we'll have half an hour of talk and then the rest of the time will be for questions and answers. But I want to make my usual plea for the USAID Alumni Association members that are here. I mean, I'm welcoming you on behalf of the USAID Alumni Association and DACOR, but for the UAA members that are here, don't forget to renew your membership this year if you haven't done so already. If you are a USAID alum and you haven't joined, please do. You can find us on the website at www.usaidalumni.org. And we are delighted that the DACOR members, we have so many DACOR members here today, and I encourage our USAID friends to join DACOR if they have not done so either. So we are very grateful to DACOR for the hospitality that we have received here and continue to receive here for these development dialogue programs. I'm particularly pleased that today we have Frank Vogl here, but I'm even more pleased that we have Mrs. Emily Vogl here, that Frank and Emily are a real team, not only in Vogl Communications Inc. or whatever their official gathering is called, but they are a team in general, and Chris Webster, who's sitting next to Emily, was saying, well, you could be giving the speech here today, and I said, yes, that is true. We'll have Emily on next week. And anyway, the subject, I mean, I'm not going to go through the long and wonderful career that Frank has had. I should just add that we worked together at the World Bank during the 1980s, but he is really a professional journalist and has been a journalist virtually all his life, and a very impassioned journalist who has causes that are very important to him, and you're going to hear about one of those today. I should say that the subject of corruption could be on the agenda here virtually every week. It's in the headlines of the newspapers all the time. South Korea is a good example of that just this morning. But also, I don't know, some of you were listening to the National Public Radio this morning in Morning Edition, and they had a very interesting story explaining the source of the emoluments clause that has become so important in some of the issues that are surrounding the new administration. And it turns out that when the founding fathers were looking around for a model for the Constitution, that they were looking at they had all these monarchies that they couldn't rely upon, but they didn't want to use those. But so they went back to Rome, and the Romans were wonderful. I mean, they had all this democracy, but there was also the Roman Empire collapsed in scandal and other such things. So when Benjamin Franklin spent 8 years in Paris and was given, as he left by King Louis XVI, I think, a diamond-encrusted something or other, there was a big scandal about whether Benjamin Franklin should be allowed to accept that. So the Founding Fathers put in the emolument clause, all because of these historical antecedents that even they found. So you may be worried about corruption today, but it is nothing new. And so Frank Vogl is going to solve all the corruption issues between now and 2 o'clock, so that there will no longer be any need to discuss this topic here. Frank, we are delighted you're here. It's great to have you, and we look forward to your comments and lots of time for questions afterwards. Frank, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex. It's an honor to be here. And the very first thing I want to say to you is it's probably the most serious thing I'm going to say this afternoon. I want to thank you. I've been involved with a group called Transparency International since before its founding in 1993. We have 90 national chapters around the world. And my thanks go to you because some of you in this room probably have been involved in USAID programs that have supported those chapters. In many countries in the world, civil society has been successful, I think, in the last 2 decades because of USAID support and more generally because of US government support. And I am deeply grateful and deeply thankful to all of you for that. I should also say that many people involved in foreign assistance and economic assistance have done an enormous amount of good by helping many, many countries to improve their public procurement laws and the ways in which those are monitored, to build institutions and capacity in government that has been a bulwark to a degree against corruption. However, former very dear friend, great journalist Michael Elliott once wrote that corruption is everywhere and it's ancient. And Michael said that Mercury probably had a crooked messenger service on Mount Olympus. Corruption is universal. And one of the great mistakes that many people made 20-odd years ago when this topic in the post-Cold War era started to become much more publicly discussed was to somehow believe this was a problem unique to developing countries. I would suggest that money in politics in the United States is not necessarily a role model for the rest of the world. And I think we've come to understand more and more how universal corruption is, even if it takes different forms in different places with different consequences. One of the most fascinating aspects that many of you who've served abroad are so conscious of is that corruption doesn't stand alone. In so many countries where you have high levels of corruption, you have high levels of violence. You have high levels of human rights abuse. You have great curbs on press freedom. You have justice departments that are totally manipulated and controlled by those in power, to the point that those in power enjoy impunity. And if we see corruption purely in isolation, we will never find ways in which it can be solved. For many parts of the world, corruption is a human rights problem. For many other parts of the world, it is a security problem in a strategic sense. And what I'd like to talk about today is corruption, security, and foreign assistance. And when I talk about security, I mean both human security and the curse of poverty, as well as security in a strategic sense. One thing is very clear. We are facing the prospect right now, as all of you are acutely aware, of major cuts in US foreign aid programs. We don't know where those cuts will be. We don't know how grave they will be, but we know they're coming. And it reminds me very much of the very start of the Reagan administration, when I had just about to join the World Bank, as it happens, when Beryl Sprinkle, an Undersecretary of the US Treasury, said to the President of the World Bank, "You are running a socialist giveaway agency." And the cuts that were then being demanded of the World Bank, and especially its IDA program, were draconian. I think, again today, we are in danger of seeing enormous cuts. What I would argue, and will try and argue to you today, is something very straightforward. We need more aid, not less aid. But if we are to make the case, and I'm going to challenge you to help me to make the case, if we're going to make the case that we do need more aid, we have to demonstrate how best it can be used, how effective it can be. And I don't think that the advocates of aid have done a sufficiently good job in that respect in recent years, because I would argue they have not sufficiently taken the issue of corruption into account. We're facing, let me start with human security and aid and corruption. the most important simple point is that wherever there's corruption, there are victims. I know that sounds obvious, but go and read all these cases that the Justice Department brings under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and you won't find the mention of a single victim. Look at so much of the discussion here about corruption, and it's as if it's a victimless crime. It isn't. And in many parts of the world, the victimization is enormous. Just take the roughly 22 resource-rich countries of sub-Saharan Africa. In almost all of them, Botswana is a notable exception, in almost all of them, the degree of poverty is absolutely horrendous. These are countries that year after year obtain tens of billions of dollars of revenues for their oil, gas, and mining sectors. And yet, from Nigeria to Angola to Guinea, for example, there are infant mortality rates, there are child death rates that are worse than in Bangladesh, that are worse in some of the other poorest parts of the world. And the only explanation is the enormous corruption that takes place at the top of those governments, where tiny elites are stealing not just money, but they are stealing, in fact, the funding to provide health services, social services, basic needs, basic security, basic education, basic medicines. And the result is that people are dying, and tens of millions of people are living in absolute poverty. And you'd think we could do something about this. So when Senator Ben Cardin and Senator Richard Lugar proposed legislation that would force US companies to reveal how much money they are paying to all those oil-rich governments abroad, we thought we would get somewhere. And the new law was meant to come into effect next year. And the very first act of the new Congress in 2017 was to get rid of that law, or basically to undermine it. And the first legislative signature by President Trump was to endorse that action by the Congress. Why? Because the oil companies happen to say they need the secrecy. It's for competitive reasons. Nonsense. Shell, BP, and others are quite willing to reveal that data. In fact, they already are doing so. But it tells you we are entering a period of secrecy, not transparency. We are entering a period where it's going to be harder to fight corruption than easier. And this is why finding the best arguments in support of more aid is more urgent than ever. By the way, don't let me just bore you by talking about corruption in monetary terms. There are tens of thousands of young women at colleges in Eastern Europe, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in many other parts of the world who are told by their university teachers that they need to make extra payments if they want passing grades. And when they say they don't have the money, then they are asked for sexual favors. The scale of sextortion is enormous. Many, many of those young people leave colleges as a result, ending any hope for themselves and for their families. We are talking about corruption in terms of humanitarian abuse on a scale that far too often is overlooked. And I would argue that our security and the security of the world, in fact, depends on doing something about that. Now, the aid agencies, and I think back, for example, to the World Bank, were, for starting in the mid to late 1990s, very good at saying publicly how bad all these problems were. But they didn't sufficiently walk the talk. Action has repeatedly lagged the rhetoric. And frankly, there haven't been enough people in the media or elsewhere to sufficiently call attention to that problem. You know, I should just give you an explanation about why I'm somewhat passionate about this problem. You may have gathered that. I was a journalist. And I had the great fortune to be an international economics journalist, and amongst other things, I covered development and development assistance. And as a result of investigating the World Bank for a period of years, the only way the World Bank thought they could shut me up was by hiring me. And so I joined the World Bank's external relations staff, and my great friend Peter Riddleberger, who's sitting here, who was one of the gurus on the staff there at the time. But I also met Alex, who had joined the bank. In fact, I'd interviewed Alex a few years earlier. He probably doesn't remember. He was a senior economist at USAID, and we did it.
What led you to be concerned about corruption?
And we, yes, and we did it. And we did an interview for Voice of America. And I worked for the World Bank for 9 years until my wife rescued me from that bureaucracy. And we started a business. But about the same time in the early 1990s, friends from the World Bank and elsewhere came together to say, we got to do something about corruption. And we formed Transparency International at that time. And what's common to all of those, that career, if you will, was a concern about poverty and economic development, and a belief, which I still hold, that we have the skills, we have the resources, we have the capacity to truly do something about it if we approach it the right way. And I gradually learned from my experiences with Transparency International, and later with another group called the Partnership for Transparency Fund, that there are very pragmatic things that can be done, that can make a difference. However, the challenge is enormous. It's taken us years to even convince the powers that be, and let's put it that way, how vital it is to include anti-corruption and justice in any agenda that seeks to reduce poverty in the world. The Sustainable Development Goals, which were approved last year by the whole of the UN system and by the General Assembly, have Article 16, which for the first time directly calls for anti-corruption action as part of the overall anti-poverty agenda. That's important. But again, we must make those words be transformed into action. One of the mistakes, quite simply, is the belief that you can fix corruption in the short term. You can't. Like serious and sustainable development progress, it's a long-term endeavor. The anti-corruption efforts so often have failed because they've been involved in short-term projects, or because even if they've been embedded in longer-term endeavors, there's been staff turnover, there's been changes in political priorities, there have been changes in resources, so that they haven't had the consistent long-term support. This is absolutely essential. And then there's another issue. Paul Collier, who many of you I'm sure know and know of, once said, "We must decisively end our schizophrenic stance of preaching decency while being lackeys for crooks and sharks." What did he mean? What he really was saying with that eloquent phrase was that for too long Western governments have publicly derided corruption, publicly stated how bad human rights are, but when they've really come together with the governments face to face, they've put those issues on the side. We have not adequately followed through on the public rhetoric. That makes the job of so many foreign service diplomats and aid workers so difficult, because even when they have tried to push the anti-corruption agenda very forcibly, there have been times and times again where they have been overridden by political superiors who have other agendas. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because I think it's the crux of how you could be challenged to work with us to find solutions that are absolutely urgent and necessary. We find time again that we know how important nation building is, even if that term has become somewhat politically incorrect. I believe passionately that there is an enormous amount that foreign aid and foreign assistance in many forms can do to help countries to build what Professor Michael Johnson calls deep democratization. What he means by that is to help countries to do four things primarily. First, increase pluralism. Second, open up safe political and economic space where people have opportunities to express their views and seek to influence political decisions. Third, reform activism. Encourage people to state their grievances, to seek to influence public opinion, and to press for change. And fourth, maintain accountability, insisting that powerful people and organizations in both public and private sectors respect rights and liberties and the rule of law. The key question is, how can we build understanding here in Congress and in the Department of State and in USAID and in the World Bank to support exactly that kind of agenda? As I said to you at the outset, Transparency International has been very fortunate in its many chapters around the world to get support from USAID. And we've got support from other development agencies. But I must tell you, overall, civil society working in countries for human rights and the kind of agenda that I just mentioned get minimal support relative to the total flow of official assistance and governmental aid. And so long as that's the case, the kind of agenda I'm talking to you about is not going to be achieved. Because the only people who can build the pluralism and the safeguards and change these societies are the people themselves in those countries. It is citizens of those countries, not external forces, who will bring the change. But what external forces can do is encourage the right trends, encourage the right people. And frankly, we're not getting enough encouragement. I met yesterday morning with John Githongo, who is a great friend and founder of TI Kenya, who was here in Washington. And when I say to John, keep safe, he says, well, I know my number's going to be up one time or another. He's 45. He's enormously brave. And he's in enormous danger because he speaks up in Kenya. And there are people around the world in the media and in civil society today who are facing greater restraints than any time in my lifetime. And we need to protest that, because these are the people who can build the deep democratization that is so essential if truly we are going to curb corruption and going to truly address the issues of human deprivation and human rights abuse and poverty that human insecurity is producing as a result of rampant and widespread corruption. Before just leaving that question, let me add one other element to this issue of human security. Google a fabulous movie called The Borneo Case. It's a marvelous documentary that describes the rape of the forests of Sarawak. Across the world, we are seeing organized crime networks, major corporations, bribing very powerful officials to destroy our environment. We need to put environment into this equation when we talk about the costs of corruption and human insecurity. It isn't done nearly enough. And yet the water systems of the world and the forests of the world are being endangered by crime and by corruption. And, you know, I can't sort of stress this enough. When property developers bribe government officials to ignore building codes, and buildings are put up in China or in Turkey or in Bangladesh and they collapse as a result of not being built to codes, people die. When vast amounts of fake medicines are bought by ministries of health in various countries because the ministers and their officials got kickbacks, then people die. when up to 20% of the pesticides sold in sub-Saharan Africa are fake, then the result is that people starve. Corruption kills. And anybody who makes light of the topic should recognize that that is the consequence. But when we talk about foreign aid and security and corruption, we need to put alongside the human insecurity the question of strategic security. Which are the countries that you find year after year after year at the bottom of our Transparency International Corruption Perception Index? Well, they include Sudan and South Sudan. They include Somalia. They include Afghanistan. They include Iraq. These countries have enormous amounts of corruption, enormous amounts of crime and human rights abuse, and in some cases, enormous amounts of US taxpayer money. And you have to ask yourself, when you look at all of the aid money, economic and military, that we have given over the years to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Egypt, just to name 4, do we feel more secure as a result? Is this a more secure world as a consequence? We have provided over $100 billion in the last 14 years in reconstruction assistance to Afghanistan. And the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan has concluded that that money has added to the problem of corruption in Afghanistan, not reduced it. We have provided enormous aid to Pakistan, military and economic. And you don't have to go very far to read articles by Carlotta Gall in the New York Times and many others who will tell you that much of that, not much, but a certain amount of that aid has directly supported the Taliban, which goes into Afghanistan to kill Americans and disrupt the situation. We give aid funds and military aid to Kenya. My friend John Gathongo said to me yesterday that funds is buying military equipment for the army in Kenya. Some people in the army are selling that equipment to Al-Shabaab, which is using it to disrupt Kenya and even kill Kenyan soldiers. Has that helped our security? So I put it to you. Why? Why is it that we have poured such vast amounts of funds into unreliable partners? Why is it that we have this special relationship with Pakistan where we pour so much money into a country whose officials and scientists provided North Korea, Libya, and Iran with nuclear weaponry and nuclear technology? Why did we do this? Why do we continue to do this? And the answer that comes back is, it is vital for us to have a strategic relationship with these countries. And I challenge all of you to the question that I don't have a clear and good answer to. How are we going to have strategic relationships with thoroughly corrupt regimes? Isn't it time we had a meaningful public discussion of that subject? We don't. We've had lots of think tank discussions. We've had even some good discussions with military people. Some friends of mine have written great books about the subject, but it's not on the front burner. And it raises profound questions as we go forward. Because if we're going to make the case for more aid, and we should, we have to be able to demonstrate it's adding to our security, and it's adding to the human security of most of the world's populations. Now, up until now, I've probably thoroughly depressed you. Let me make a final point before opening this up. There are tens of millions of people in Romania and Brazil and South Africa and Malaysia and Ukraine and Guatemala and South Korea who are fed up with corruption. And for various reasons, and each country is different, one thing we've seen is an unprecedented amount of massive public demonstrations in those countries demanding that the systems of justice work. And the results have been, by and large, extraordinary. The fact that the scion of the biggest construction company in Latin America is now in prison in Brazil for 19 years is amazing. The fact that the U.S. Justice Department could bring a case against the Odebrecht construction company, which showed that they have been bribing governments in 12 countries over the last few years systematically in order to win contracts, was only possible because of cooperation with the Brazilian judiciary, the Swiss, and others. And the result of that is that the former president of Peru is under indictment for corruption. There are investigations in Colombia and in another 10 countries. And we have never seen anything like that before. There is more cooperation between government, police, and prosecuting officers and the U.S. Justice Department in this area internationally than we've ever had before, and as a result, more cases are coming forward. We are seeing the public demanding justice. We are seeing a revolution in Brazil, in my opinion, as the issue of corruption has absolutely taken hold thanks to the Petrobras case. As you've seen from today's papers, for the first time, the president of South Korea has been thrown out of office because of corruption, as well as leading members of some of the biggest conglomerate corporations in the country. We are seeing something happen. When Romanians go into the street and say no impunity for any parliamentarian, and the government has to backtrack and set aside a rule that would have allowed people to take illicit cash up to about 45,000, I think, a year or something like that. They had to backtrack on that. In Romania, you hear daily from Ukraine about people who are trying very, very hard to get to grips with the endemic corruption that over decades has seeped into every corner of the public sector there. Even the IMF is about to issue a new policy paper. It goes to its board in late April that for the first time will try to comprehensively deal with how the IMF should be dealing with governance and corruption. There is something happening. The fund wouldn't take that to its board if it didn't believe that there were enough countries represented on the board that would actually support it. So we are making progress, and the progress is coming from citizen engagement. It's coming from grassroots actions in the countries. I believe we're at a critical moment. I don't think the Trump administration understands these issues. Certainly, it has given not the slightest indication that it does. We've heard not a single word from the Secretary of State on the subject, so we just may hope, I suppose. But I should point out that his former company, Exxon, was leading the charge for the last few years to get rid of the legislation whereby U.S. companies had to disclose their revenue payments to foreign governments. We need an era of transparency, not secrecy. We need to make the best possible case for more aid and not simply sit back and accept the cuts that are going to come. We need to demonstrate that we have the knowledge, we have the skill, and I hope we have the zeal to take on corruption as a central pillar of any effort to improve the quality of aid that is given, to improve, as a result, human and strategic security. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Frank. That's wonderful. You may control the questions and answers. Christine has a microphone, and when you ask the question, please identify yourself. And Frank, you'll control it. Whatever. I'm in control, right? You are.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Judith Henderson, retired commercial counselor from the Foreign Commercial Service. We know your Transparency International Index quite well. We used it in business counseling and preparing annual reports as required by Congress. This is a bit of a in the weeds question, but I understand that your focus is primarily looking outward. My focus right now is looking inward. And I want to know your parameters of compiling the ratings, where the United States stands, I don't know, 20th or something in your list. Are you going to break out in the future how you do your ratings among developing, emerging, and OECD countries? In other words, we're not talking about street cops like they have in Mexico who are constantly bribing. We're talking about a much more nuanced type of corruption here. And I don't know whether you want to take on something like that, but it seems to me we need to define corruption in line with development and develop a separate index for the so-called developed world.
Good question. The U.S., in our latest index, it's called the Corruption Perception Index, transparency.org/CPI. We rank approximately every year 178 countries in the latest. What is this ranking? It is a poll of polls. The World Bank, the World Economic Forum, Gallup, and several other organizations every year in various international polls that they're doing of business and others are asking questions about corruption. We take all of that data from all of these polls, we analyze that, and that produces, through a methodology that you can find on our website, the rankings. But that's not enough. I agree. That gives you a sort of snapshot in time, a big overview. So every 2 to 3 years, we produce something called the Global Barometer. For example, our Africa Barometer looked at 28 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It asked in depth a lot of questions about how much people paid on bribes every year, who did they pay them to, which were the worst sectors for corruption and extortion, and so on. We do similar ones for each region of the world. The weakest of them all is probably with regard to North America. And the reason for that is partly because there are so many other sources of data on corruption in North America. Gallup does regular polls on trust in government. There is an enormous amount of information from the Center for Public Integrity on money and politics in this country. We know a lot about the problems. We may not like the fact that we're not that good at solving them. But there is lots of other sources. So I would urge you to look at the CPI, look at the Global Barometer data, but then in certain countries like the US and in fact like the European Union, look more at what other organizations are doing, because some of them are doing some wonderful work in identifying the problems. And I agree, there are big differences, clearly. Yes, sir. Yes, go on. Yes. Yes. Yeah, he needs a mic. Okay.
Hi, Larry Garber. Great presentation. Two related comments or questions. One is I think your perspective on a number of the countries where large amounts of assistance is given and the country ranks consistently at the top of the corruption rankings, or the worst of the corruption rankings, is well known. But I would say that many, maybe not all, but many of the people in this room who've worked in these countries would believe that they are committed to addressing corruption and through the programs, and are frustrated as anyone else that they don't succeed, but they're doing it with the best of intentions. And so how do you deal with the dissonance of, on the one hand, these countries are consistently bad, and on the other hand, the people who are implementing these programs clearly understand what you're talking about and are trying, through their programs, through their diplomatic interventions, to address the problem. And related to that is, today we have the phenomenon which you alluded to of what we call closing space, which is affecting many, many organizations that are working to address problems of corruption, human rights, etc., in these countries. And the governments are, cracking down, not only on these organizations, but also on the providers of assistance. And what it's raising for the providers of assistance is a very difficult challenge of whether to continue providing assistance, but perhaps in a quote-unquote less transparent manner to avoid some of the restrictions, or to remain consistent with the principle of all assistance should be transparent, even if it runs the risk of being compromised by the government cracking down.
Larry, those are great questions, and they go to the core of really the problem I'm trying to pose. You see, I don't think going along is good enough anymore. I think foreign service workers, our diplomats, people working for USAID, people working for many of the contractors for USAID, have absolutely the best intentions. But they've got to step back and take a longer view of what has happened. I am sure, and I have this from various friends who have first-hand experience, I don't, that President Ghani in Afghanistan wants to end corruption. That he's a good man who's dedicated to doing the right thing. But I'm also told that there are a lot of other players in Afghanistan who don't share his view and have independent power. And everybody knows it. And we keep on supplying them with funds. And the opium trade increases. And the organized crime networks increase in their power. And the damage is being done. And at some point, the people with the best intentions have to say, we need to think through what are going to be effective sanctions. And it's not a subject that's adequately discussed. A few years ago, there was a completely fraudulent election in Kenya. And under intense pressure, the World Bank ceased disbursements for 2 months. Everybody in Kenya laughed. That wasn't a serious sanction. We have got a mentality that drives so many people involved in aid agencies to get the money out, to disperse, to keep on pushing it out. And sometimes you have to say stop. And I don't see enough of that. And it worries me because of all the reasons that I explained earlier. The issue of supporting civil society, supporting round corners, trying to help, and all the rest of it, I think is great. But, it's not going to work if it's not taken to a much higher level and become a much more central and key issue, because we're losing that fight. The number of countries which are now suppressing civil society and the number of journalists who are dying is increasing. The number of the people who run those countries, who have offshore accounts, and we are almost at the first anniversary of the publication of the Panama Papers, is horrendous. We can impose sanctions. We can stop the kleptocrats from parking their money all over the world. We can do many things to make their life very uncomfortable. But we basically do not. And I only would suggest to you that however well-intentioned people are in trying to do their job on the ground, there comes a point in time they have to step back and say, this isn't working. I'll give you just, a microcosm. For years, the American Bar Association was supporting programs to train judges in certain parts of the world, and everybody who was directly involved with those programs told me that the programs were very good. But there was a missing ingredient that I found out in several countries. The judges weren't paid a living wage. So what do you do if you're a judge? You've got all the training from the ABA. You know all of the good stuff that you're meant to do. You've got a guy in the dock who is up there for not paying his taxes, and he offers you the equivalent of several years' pay. I mean, you know, we have to get real. We have to understand that so much of this technical assistance, so much of the other things that we've been doing have not produced the desired results over time. And I would argue we have to look at sanctions very seriously. We have to speak much more publicly about these problems, and we have to urge our government to be much more forthright. And I think it's more complicated than a morning tweet. Yes, please.
Yes, thanks for this really incredible conversation this afternoon. My name is Lori Rowley. I work for Senator Lugar at the Lugar Center, a think tank that he started after he left the Senate. I really appreciate your words about the Cardin-Lugar provision, and it was a very sad day for us at the center when Congress took the action. My question for you is about the comment you made earlier in your presentation about the FCPA and the Justice Department aggressive activity over the time of the Obama administration. It really has been unbelievable. It's actually collected hundreds of millions of dollars from companies who have come under FCPA investigations. And you were so on the mark in saying that when you read one of those DPAs, there's no conversation at all about the victims or what's going on with the kleptocrats who took the money. The companies definitely had to step up and pay, and then it's over. And it just seems to me there's something missing. We haven't completed the cycle, and how can we move to really make an impact there?
There are several things missing. First of all, President Trump has called the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, a horrible law. And there's a piece in David Ignatius's column today in the Washington Post where he says that Secretary Tillerson actually pushed back on the president with regard to FCPA, saying that in fact it was helpful to Exxon in not paying bribes. The FCPA, just like the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which was modeled on the FCPA and which 41 countries have signed, does not mention in any respect any penalties on those who took the bribes. It is solely focused on the corporations who bribed foreign government officials. But we have a real breakthrough with the Odebrecht case. And this is really very important because, I think, because if you look individually at these various cases of the last few years, it becomes evident that the Justice Department could never have built these cases without cooperation from foreign governments. And those champions in those foreign governments, and by the way, so many anti-corruption projects work, and they work because people in the public sector in so many countries are real champions. They want to do the right thing, and they are helpful to work with civil society to make good things happen. And I maybe haven't emphasized that enough today, but it does happen. So as the cooperation deepens with many countries, those people who are supplying the evidence are also concerned about their own national leaders who are taking the bribes. One of the most important test cases of this will be with Malaysia. The Swiss, the Singaporean authorities, and the US authorities are all investigating the disappearance of upwards of $3 billion from a development fund in Malaysia, of which allegedly $800 million is in the private bank account of the president of Malaysia. What's so interesting is that as the US built their case, and they built a civil case against people who've parked $1 billion of that amount in the US, they got information from the Malaysian Public Prosecutor's Office. There were people with the guts there to be helpful, without which I'm told that case would not have been broken. So we're seeing change. The fact that former President Toledo in Peru is now facing indictment shows that the government of Peru, perhaps because of what's been happening in Brazil and elsewhere, doesn't want to let Toledo get away with being a recipient, allegedly, of Odebrecht bribery. So I think that is changing. As for the victims, I'm speaking to several law schools in the panels, and each time I do that, I challenge the lawyers to start thinking about victims in this case, but they don't. It's a real gap, and I think we are. I think it's a very serious gap. The one exception was a case in the UK where a British arms manufacturer had bribed officials in Tanzania. And the judge in the case said, well, I think the $50 million, 30 million pounds at the time, fine should go back to the people of Tanzania because they're the victims. The company said that's very difficult to do. The British DFID aid people said, oh, that's very difficult to do. 6 months later, the judge hauled them back into court and said, well, have you done it? And they said, oh, no, it's very difficult to do. So the judge gave them a deadline. And a whole program working with civil society was set up to support schools in communities across Tanzania directly with the funding and bypass the government. It's the only case I know of where the fines have actually gone to help the victims. Meanwhile, just on your point, the amount of repatriated assets is puny compared to the amount that has been stolen by kleptocrats. From Abacha in Nigeria to Mubarak in Egypt onwards, the amount of money that these people have deposited or had deposited in banks, primarily in Switzerland, the UK, and offshore, is staggering. The amount that's been repatriated is absolutely tiny. And that's because our own governments are not pushing that enough. And that is part of the redress to victims. Yes?
What would you recommend in a situation where we are dealing with a local official? We know he's corrupt, but he's also competent and is getting things done. And where the alternative arguably might be even worse.
Do you know that it'll be worse for sure?
Well, I'm supposing that it would be. I mean, let's say we know the people in question, we know what the possibilities are for replacement, and we come to the conclusion that it's not going to get any better with a replacement. Arguably, it might get worse. What would you recommend in this situation?
Right, can we expand that? Those of us who've been in the aid business for a long time have often heard the argument that corruption is fine because it greases the wheels of progress and so on, that you need that in order to keep things going. And it's really similar to the question that has just been asked. And so answer it in the broader sense too, because it is a long-standing view that many people working in the aid business had over the years. So you're suggesting a radical change in that approach.
Just to add, for years, British diplomats would not report when British companies paid bribes overseas. They knew it was in violation of the law, but it was good for British business, so they didn't report it. How long do you go along before you're so compromised that you've lost your integrity? I know the pressures are tremendous. The pressures to get the project done. The pressures to find good people who are willing to do good things, even if they're crooked. But I would argue as passionately as I can that the vast majority of the citizens of the country in which these situations play out, would not endorse supporting a corrupt official. And after all, we serve the citizens of the country. They know best. Why don't we rely on them? If we find that we're dealing with officials who are corrupt, we have choices, usually. Either find other officials to help us on that project, don't do the project at all, or try to go back to the drawing board and work with local civil society to find an alternative approach. We've done, under the Partnership for Transparency Fund, which was created about 16 years ago. It is an organization that has about 70 retired world bankers helping as voluntary advisors. We've found that we've done many, many projects in many developing countries where time and time again we've been able to find that local civil society knows which officials in the government are going to be helpful. We don't know. Our advisors don't know. Half the time the people in the embassies don't know, but local civil society does. And what I think has been a transformation in the last 15 years or so has been a huge explosion and expansion of civil society in many countries. And I think that's made it easier. But I don't buy for a moment, and I said this in my early remarks, that a little bit of corruption does good, because it leads to a little more and a little more and a little more, and in the end the whole system is infected. And people point to individual cases where a little bit of greasing the wheels worked. I don't think the citizens of the country will buy that. And it's so interesting. Some years ago, because the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act allows facilitating payments. Some years ago, I was involved in doing a survey of our Transparency International national chapters about what people thought about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I got a very staunch defense from friends in the United States about how important facilitating payments were. I asked them, by the way, what they would think if a foreign company tried to bribe a U.S. immigration official. And I can also tell you it takes longer to get a visa from the U.S. Immigration Service than it does in the immigration services of most developing countries. But quite apart from that, overwhelmingly, people in the developing countries who were working with chapters of TI said this is bribery. This is undermining our country. We have to listen to the people and serve the people of these countries. And the challenge for very often an assistance is to go beyond only serving the government in power. And I argue that with the World Bank people all the time, because they say they have an obligation only to deal with the government. And I say you don't have any obligation to deal with crooks. And I think this is very serious. I think we have to trust the citizens of countries first and not make these judgments. And supporting corrupt officials in foreign countries is part of a whole pattern that leads to an acceptance of corruption. And we've seen country after country, the more it's accepted, the worse it gets. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you would, my name's Tom Johnson, combine or reflect on political stability and corruption. Do you find countries with a high level of stability less corrupt or more corrupt? Or is there where you have flux, people trying to make it while they can because they're not going to be there the next day?
I think if you look at our index, you have a very clear answer. Denmark, New Zealand, Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, those year after year are perceived to have the lowest levels of corruption. I would argue they are also countries with a great deal of political stability. All right. Then let's go to, let me look at the list. Uruguay, Bahamas, Chile, Bhutan, Slovenia, Botswana, these are the ones that rank best amongst developing countries. And I would argue that there too, you have, relatively speaking, low levels of corruption. I think it goes hand in hand. I think we all suffer from the disease, developed and developing, of money and politics, and too much money under the table. Of course, in this country, we allow the money to be above the table. The story that Alex Shakow started with today about the Emoluments Clause and Benjamin Franklin, there's a marvelous book by Professor Zephyr Teachout called Corruption in America, and it starts with that story. And it goes on to Citizens United and to actions by the Supreme Court in recent years that have essentially created what I call legalized corruption, of which there is a great deal. And I think in some respects it's got worse. Nevertheless, the political stability by and large and levels of corruption, I think, go hand in hand. Actually, so does violence. So does, if you look at the World Peace Index, if you look at Freedom House's Freedom Index, if you put all these indices together, you find very close correlations.
Peter Amato, you said alumnus. That was the exact question I was going to ask. These indices of political freedom, economic freedom, the ease of doing business, and that's one that the bank uses.
Yes, very good one.
What is the correlation? Because when you look at those, the transparency index doesn't appear to really come out. It doesn't suggest that there is a relationship. Is it an inverse relationship, ease of doing business, or is it a direct positive? And you know you have Singapore up there at the top. You have several other countries that you've mentioned
Right.
that are transparent. They do not have the corruption. How do they fit in?
It's a very good question, and I'll make it even worse. A lot of data on the ease of doing business if you're a woman is significantly different to the ease of doing business if you're a man in quite a few countries. So we shouldn't ignore even the gender issues. Just like when I was talking about poverty and corruption, by far, overwhelmingly, it is women who are the hardest hit for many social reasons, many development reasons that many of you know. There is some of a correlation, but it's not very good. And it's a very interesting factor. And one thing that is important is that wherever you have very serious grand corruption, you also have petty corruption. There's no country where you don't where that's not the case. But the prevalence of petty corruption to the degree that you find you're paying rents to get business licenses and all the rest of it varies enormously. I think India does very badly, for example, on some of those business indexes when it comes to exactly that kind of red tape. But it falls roughly in the middle of the pack when it comes to the overall CPI. I can't really explain it, but it's a good question.
As you probably know, we have our contractors, many contractors who do work with aid, who look at those other industries and say these are doing business, but they are not bringing up the transparency. How does it happen? And I'm just wondering if that is an area that it's got a link in.
How many of your contractors, not yours, but how many USA contractors have said, we don't want that contract because the country's too corrupt? I was approached to work for one of those contractors on a particular country, and I said, you must be joking. This is impossible to do what you want to do there. They said, thank you very much, and they went somewhere else. I mean, that's part of... Sorry to answer your question like that, but I think it's a real problem. The more that aid has been contracted out, without those kind of basic transparency and integrity safeguards, the more we have a problem. Yes, boy, all these hands.
A number of years ago, when I was working in the private sector and raising capital from U.S. Export Credit Agencies, we found that the various export credit agencies, U.S. Exim Bank, ECGD, Hermes, Saatchi, and of course COFAS. And this goes back a number of years ago. COFAS had a line item in their export credit application which said, what type of bribe did you pay to get this job? It was financeable. And because of really the pressures, and I think US Exim Bank was a pretty strong advocate to make changes, we at least got COFAS to remove that line item. Whether corruption was paid in any other way isn't clear. But at least, it just shows you how a parent, even with a government export credit agency, had a line item that permitted financing of corruption.
Yeah, but it's very, very interesting. I don't know enough about this, but I know there are a lot of experts in the room on this subject. We once, in Transparency International, did a bribe payers index, where we did our own surveys using Gallup of the headquarter countries of companies that were perceived to pay bribes. And the US came out in a pretty good position. And so we did a follow-up survey to try to find out why. Not that we thought American business was particularly corrupt, but we just were quite interested. It was interesting, by the way, Singapore came out terribly. So although Singapore domestically looks so clean and free of transparency, Singaporean companies didn't feel any inhibition about paying bribes outside their country. What did we discover in one survey result? It was widely perceived that the US embassies played a bigger role in promoting the interests of US companies with greater effect than foreign embassies. And as a Swedish diplomat said to me at the time, what do we have to offer? If a Swedish company is up against an American company, the president of the United States, if necessary, can pick up the phone and phone the government in question. That has influence. The president of Sweden wouldn't even get to first base. That is a tremendous business advantage. So it's not just bribery, it's also leverage. And unfortunately, it is that kind of thinking that has led to these kinds of distortions that you're just mentioning. The perception that in order to compete with the US on big government procurement contracts internationally, you have to resort to actions because you're up against all of that US pressure. I don't buy that for a moment, by the way. I don't think that's a justification. But I've heard that argument many times. And the real tragedy is that even though the OECD Convention was passed in 1998, which put an end to many of the practices you're talking about, German companies could no longer, for example, write off their bribes against their taxes, which they used to do. Many of these habits have lingered on, and enforcement in many countries remains very lax. Yes, sir.
Hi, David Cohen. I'd like to focus on the last thing you said during your talk about the success stories. The question that I have is, in any of those success stories, is there an example of where some foreign assistance, be it from the World Bank or the United States or the European Union, etc., had an input? One of the things I think we can understand from experience in anti-corruption programs is, as you point out, the role of civil society in changing overall political will. And clearly that's where civil society has its input. And yet, in going over my often deficient memory of what you said were the success stories. I don't know that there was an assistance input to any of those. And does that inform any future kind of assistance to this area?
Wonderful question, thank you. Please look, everybody, at a thing called CICIC in Guatemala. Guatemala was a country torn apart by violence. And early in this century, some very bright people came together. USAID, United Nations, the Organization for American States, and they said, something has to be done about the rule of law in Guatemala. And there were increasing public demonstrations demanding that there be some sort of justice system put in place. And under foreign funding, including, in fact not including, but basically led by USAID, a team of public prosecutors was brought to Guatemala from outside the country to help the Attorney General. They have worked for years, and there have been regular public demonstrations in support of the Attorney General in that country. And they have been very, very successful. The latest chief public prosecutor to have been brought in under the program came from Colombia and had enormous experience in dealing with corruption in Colombia. The CICIC program is working. The Attorney General has felt greatly empowered by having a team of real expert prosecutors and investigators to rely upon. The public's been encouraged. Over 30 senior members of the Parliament have been indicted, including the last Vice President and President of the country, who were both forced to resign because of corruption charges. Violence hasn't ended in Guatemala. Corruption hasn't ended in Guatemala. They have major problems. But the CICIC model has been a really tremendous story of how foreign assistance has helped in an anti-corruption program where civil society has also been engaged. So the same idea was promoted for Honduras. And unfortunately, the program for Honduras was somewhat watered down. But the Guatemala model, I think, is one that a lot of people have been looking at. And it truly is a case of tremendous support over many years by foreign aid. And USAID has been the leader there.
Hi, thanks for the presentation, Jay Anania. I'm retired from the State Department. I'm now the Secretary for Administration and Finance of the OAS, which is next door. And the OAS is running that program, Mission Against Corruption and Impunity in Honduras. And I should note that the U.S. is the #1 funder of that program. And it is not quite as robust as what went on in Guatemala, but it is ongoing. And I should note that it's extremely low cost compared to what the U.S. might do directly. It also has the seal of approval of the OAS, which is a regional body, which makes it gives it additional credibility. And the public prosecutors in Honduras are in fact bringing cases against senior government officials. Just in the last few weeks, they brought one. And so while it may be watered down, it doesn't mean that it's not working. And it needs support from the international community. The OAS itself is in a financial crisis, and donors have been reducing their contributions, and in fact it threatens exactly these sorts of programs. As a CODA, I should also note that one of the true heroes of the Guatemalan situation was a public prosecutor. Her last name is Pasipas, and she essentially has had to leave the country because of, I think, threats against her. It just so happens that she's our new Secretary for Hemispheric Security and just started about 2 weeks ago here next door. Thank you.
I should add that another hero in Honduras is Transparency International Honduras. Our team down there are completely crazy and wonderful. They face death threats literally every day. You know, Honduras, by some accounts, is the murder capital of the world. And the TI Honduras group has been in the forefront of helping with this new program and with previous programs, in part to do witness protection. Because the reason why 96 out of 100 murders are never investigated or prosecuted in Honduras is because the witnesses are too scared to come forward. There's been no witness protection, and TI Honduras has played a very big role in that. But I have to tell you, we don't know, and we're very worried about whether this program is going to be sustained. The program's only been going for a couple of years. It's in its infancy. In order to really pay off, it's going to have to be a long-term program. It depends on substantial U.S. support, and we hope we'll get that U.S. support. But meanwhile, TI Honduras is a fascinating group because they get funded to a large extent by Hondurans who live in the United States. The diaspora of Hondurans is supporting the national chapter there, which is an interesting facet and aspect of this story.
Well, since it's a conversation, I'll just add a little more, excuse me. So, in fact, yes, the moxie, as it's called, is tenuous, and it's because of a lack of long-term commitment by donors and consistent commitment by donors. The U.S. has put forward quite a lot of money. Canada has now come to the table, but donors are often unwilling to make longer-term commitments, and of course that weakens the potential impact of the program. It makes it very hard to set up the infrastructure necessary and to attract the people necessary to keep these programs going. So that's very definitely a big issue in the Honduras program. And as noted, Honduras is extremely dangerous. Now, I just retired from the Department of State. One of my assignments was management counselor in Baghdad, so security is something that I think about. We have those people in Honduras working with absolutely minimal security. I mean, the sort of security that you might have on your home is pretty much what we have down there, and that's another huge risk, again, because donors are so unwilling to put up money to cover what they consider to be superfluous administrative costs. Well, that includes security in this case, and certainly one of my great preoccupations is over the fact that I have virtually, and I'm in charge of security for the OAS, by the way, we have virtually no capacity to enhance security at that mission, and that's a big, big risk.
But if I may make a plea to you, thinking about my friends in Honduras, thinking about my TI colleagues in Venezuela, and various other parts of the region, why can't the OAS make a really big public stand to support the safety of civil society in Latin America? We haven't seen it. We don't have it on the record. Now, you have just joined, so you can change this. So when we meet
I'm the management guy.
No. I mean, I mean this, but yeah, but it has to get, more of an echo, because I have to worry every day about what's happening to our people in Venezuela right now. I mean, this is a horrendous situation of a country that's completely in chaos. And those people who stand up against it and try to protect people against corruption in Venezuela and human rights abuse in Venezuela are facing enormous pressures. And the world has to stand up and say, this is a real problem, and not wait till they're imprisoned and murdered before getting on the front page. Good. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, thank you. I would like to thank all of you. I think we're sort of out of time, but I would just like to say one final word. Thank you very much again for all of your support in the past, for TI and for what you've done against corruption. And let me say that the reason we do this, my colleagues and I, and there are many of them, is because we really hope for a world where every single individual can live in dignity. That's our mission. And I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to share some of that with you today. Thank you.
Don't go away. Frank, thank you very, very much. I should have mentioned at the beginning that one of Frank's most recent books is Waging War on Corruption. Yes, Waging War on Corruption, which is well worth a read. And this was not 2012. I couldn't imagine it was that long ago that you published that. But the story is the same and the fight is the same. And we thank you very, very much on behalf of the USAID Alumni Association. And Christine, are you going to do the honors for DACOR?
DACOR is also very happy that you came today. We have a couple gifts for you here. This is about our house, our beautiful house here. I don't know how much corruption was involved in this building, but I don't think the book touches on that, but I'm sure there was a bit somewhere. And there's also an application for membership. We'd love to have you join DACOR, and we'd certainly welcome you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your coming. And again, thank you to Emily and to Frank Vogl. Thanks all, everybody.